Good morning to our colleagues in the United States and our friends across the pond. My name is Matthew Bergman. I'm an attorney in Seattle, Washington, and a director of the Naval Historical Foundation. We are pleased and honored to present to all of you our second Saturday program, Nelson at 250. Our program will lead with remarks from British historian Stephen Howarth, discussing the formative years of Lord Nelson's life and how it led to his excellent leadership at Trafalgar and before. We will have a series of commentators led by our staff historian Dave Winkler and an active and vibrant question and answer session. 250 years after he first went to sea, Lord Nelson continues to inspire and educate. Nelson's lessons in leadership extend beyond military leadership to provide inspiration and solace to anybody facing an overwhelming adversary against daunting odds. As a trial lawyer representing individuals against large corporations, I've applied 3 lessons from Lord Nelson's leadership to my practice of law. First, Lord Nelson's strategy at Trafalgar jettisoned conventional naval doctrine and confronted his adversary, the French and Spanish armadas, with tactics that they never expected. In litigation, I tried to deploy similar tactics, surprising my adversaries in ways that they did not expect, and jettisoning the doctrine of conventionality in the process. Second, Lord Nelson, as a leader, mentored a corps of captains and officers who were well-trained, able to innovate and exercise independent judgment in real time in the heat of battle. He trusted Collingwood to lead the second column, knowing that Collingwood's independent judgment when faced with battle would lead to victory. As a lawyer, I have learned that great leadership does not come from giving orders, but providing your subordinates with the judgment and independent ability to make good decisions on their own in the heat of battle. Third, Nelson's bravery was animated by his faith and patriotism and subordination of his personal safety and the safety of his fleet to protect the British people from harm. While less grand, my legal advocacy is motivated by my love of my clients and belief in the righteousness of their cause. Nelson teaches that when faced with daunting conflict, legal or military, leaders must deploy a similar sense of selflessness and view their work with a higher objective and a greater moral purpose. With that, let me turn the program over to Stephen. But before I do so, let me thank all of you out there who are members of the Naval Historical Foundation for your continued support of our organization. And if you're not members, please visit our website, www.navyhistory.org, and join us in what we do. Thank you very much, and over to you, Stephen.
I'm Stephen Howarth. I've been an independent professional author of history all my working life, and in that time it was my pleasure and privilege to co-author 2 books with my late father, David Howarth. You can see one of them 4 from the left in this little stack of some of my books. Nelson, the Immortal Memory, and that is the basis for much of this talk to you today. I'm proud to have served in the Royal Navy, albeit in a junior capacity, and I have great admiration for the US Navy. So it's a double pleasure to have been invited by the US Naval Historical Foundation to offer you this talk. My brief is to note those who influenced Nelson the most, and for that reason I'm going to concentrate on the first 3 quarters of his life, because in the 4th quarter he was the one who did the influencing. He was a fierce and skillful fighter, but a gentle, kindly man. So one can write of his deeds without the sin of exalting violence. His life ended in a classic heroic climax at the height of battle, but it had started in rural simplicity and peace in the hamlet of Burnham Thorpe, within distant sound of the sea on the northern coast of Norfolk. Here's his mother, Catherine Nelson. Her maiden name was Suckling. Her brother, Maurice Suckling, was a senior captain in the Royal Navy, and they were related to the wealthy neighbouring family of Walpole. Horatio, the rather pompous name she gave her third son, was a Walpole name. At home, his own family called him Horace, but of course in later life, most people either called him Nelson, or Sir, or just my lord. Compared to Catherine, Nelson's father, the Reverend Edmund Nelson, was of humbler but learned stock. His father too had been a Norfolk parson, but had been educated at Eton and Cambridge. Edmund was a gentle and loving man, but strict as well, and between them, he and Catherine had no fewer than 11 children. Quite a typical number at that time, and it was not unusual that 3 of them died in infancy. Here's a reminder of the location of Norfolk, Nelson's home county. In the region known as East Anglia, to the east of England, of course, it juts out into the North Sea and is beautiful in summer, very cold in winter. This modern map shows the major arterial roads, not one of which even comes close to Burnham Thorpe. This beautiful map from the year 1611 shows Norfolk much more as it was in Nelson's childhood and long after that time. Myriad small villages, and to the east of centre, the county town, Norwich. Its population then was about 30,000, and at that time it was England's second largest city, after London. Norwich today is less than 1 hour's drive from Burnham Thorpe, but for Nelson as a boy, going there was a major outing. It was at least 6 hours by coach. Norwich has the largest walled centre and longest run of medieval defences in England. Its economy then was mainly dependent on the wool trade, and the city was metropolitan in atmosphere, educated and politically engaged, with England's first provincial newspaper, the Norwich Post, starting in 1701. Now we're looking at the northwest corner of that very beautiful map, and if you look halfway down on its right-hand side, you'll see Burnham Thorpe. Below the unicorn's hoof lies Burnham Norton, and below that, Burnham Thorpe. The village population was about 350 or so, very much a rural community. As was the case with most English villages, 3 places were at the heart: the church, the village green, and the pub. The church here, All Saints, isn't exactly as the Nelsons knew it. Although dating from the 13th century and earlier, it had a fair amount of Victorianisation. But the baby Horatio was christened in its medieval font, and his parents, the Reverend Edmund and Mother Catherine, are both buried there. Nelson assumed for a long time that eventually he would join them there. Across from the church, and approaching the pub, the village's huge, magnificent green is big enough to host a cricket pitch, that other staple of English village life. And of course, the pub today is named the Lord Nelson. In fact, it was the first pub in the whole of England to be named after him, following his unparalleled triumph at the Battle of the Nile in 1798. But before then, it was called with more rustic simplicity the Plough, a place he visited when he was back at Burnham Thorpe on half pay. For the Nelson family, home was the parsonage, a large house for a large family. The slightly fanciful scene here shows Catherine playing with one of her daughters and the family dog, while Reverend Edmund rescues another daughter from a playful brother, presumably meant to be Horace, given the flag that he's holding. Only 2 miles from Burnham Thorpe, the network of creeks at the village of Burnham Overy were highly attractive, both as playground and learning ground for young sailors. And, as this modern photo shows, it's much the same today. Altogether, a pretty idyllic life for the boy, who was active, lively, and audacious. But, at Christmas in 1767, When he was only 9 years old, tragedy struck the family. His mother died, age only 42, followed just a few days later by her own mother. This sad and pensive portrait is said to be of Horace, or Horatio, at age 8. Some people doubt that it's of him at all, but I'm inclined to accept it. With his two elder brothers, Maurice and William, Horace was a term-time boarder at the all-boys King Edward VI Grammar School in Norwich, with its grand chapel adjacent to the cathedral. The school can trace its roots right back to the 11th century, and today still celebrates Horatio Nelson as the most famous of its former pupils. After their mother's death, the Nelson brothers were sent to the Paston School at North Walsham, a bit closer to Burnham Thorpe. Along with its smart new building and teaching of the classics, its new headmaster established its reputation as the county's best school for discipline. Horace was there for just over 2 years, until an event halfway around the world triggered his departure. He described it later as, quote, the disturbance with Spain relative to the Falkland Islands, claimed by both Britain and Spain. On this occasion, the crisis was sparked by a Spanish landing with 5 ships and 1,400 men at Port Egmont in West Falkland, that's in the top left of the picture, on June the 10th, 1770. Here's Admiral of the Fleet Edward Hawke, the first Baron Hawke and First Lord of the Admiralty. It was he who mobilised the Royal Navy during the crisis, and one must say he has a magnificent waistcoat, covering an equally magnificent waist. The 1770 crisis was resolved diplomatically, but more than 2 centuries later, in response to an Argentinian invasion in 1982, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had the same reaction as Lord Hawke, what you could indeed call a hawkish reaction. Back in 1770, however, the crisis prompted 2 family results. One was the recall to active duty of Captain Maurice Suckling, uncle of the Nelson brothers and sisters. After the death of their mother and his sister Catherine, Captain Suckling offered to take one of the Nelson boys to sea in due course, and that was the other family result which went on to affect the whole world. Horatio asked his father's permission to take up Captain Suckling's offer. The Reverend Edmund agreed, and Captain Suckling famously replied, "What has poor Horatio done, who is so weak, that he should be sent to rough it out at sea? But let him come, and the first time we go into action, a cannonball may knock off his head and provide for him at once." So, Horatio, who had probably never been out of Norfolk, made the 160-mile trek to Chatham Dockyard. When Horatio eventually arrived to join his uncle's ship, the 64-gun Raisonnable, it was with, quote, fresh gales, squally weather and snow, as the ship's log says, and nobody was expecting him at all. He waited and waited on the open deck until someone directed him to go down 2 decks and find a hammock in the orlop deck, smelling of tar and hemp. He grew up to be famously fearless, but his introduction to the Navy might have been the most daunting experience of his 12-year-old life. When Nelson said he, quote, went to sea in the Raisonnable, he meant he joined her as his first billet in the Royal Navy. They didn't actually go to sea. The ship's records show that Horace Nelson from Wells in Norfolk was mustered on 1st January 1771. That's the middle of those 3 entries. This predates his actual appearance on the ship in March. Captains used this ploy to ensure their protégés could claim more sea time towards the 6 years required to take the lieutenancy examination. The disturbance with Spain was resolved by diplomacy, and Raisonnable stayed at home, so Captain Suckling also helped Horatio by finding him a job in a merchant ship, Mary Ann, to give him sea experience. Her skipper was a former shipmate of Suckling, and the voyage to Jamaica and Tobago and other islands lasted a year, during which Horatio became a practical seaman, but also absorbed a horror of work conditions in the Royal Navy. The result was that back with his uncle, he was rather cocky and recalcitrant, but his uncle Suckling promised that if he did well at navigation, he would be allowed to sail in the ship's cutter, not as a passenger, but as a working crew member and later in command. This was very appealing, and Nelson said later, "By degrees I became a good pilot and confident of myself among rocks and sands." A great new chance for peacetime adventure arose, a scientific expedition to the Arctic. Still only 14, Nelson was strictly too young to go, but he was as competent as many older men, and was accepted as a coxswain by Captain Skeffington Lutwidge in the ominously named HMS Carcass. Scientifically, the voyage was mostly a failure, because Carcass and her companion HMS Racehorse became stuck fast in the ice, which soon threatened to crush them. But in plans to escape by boat, 14-year-old Midshipman Nelson was given command of a 4-oared cutter with 12 men. And in a notorious episode, Nelson tried to attack a polar bear to bring its skin back to his father. Unlike this romanticised Victorian painting, there was actually a chasm between the boy and the bear. Captain Lutwidge fired a blank shot to scare it away and wrote about it, but Nelson never did. Perhaps he was embarrassed. Nelson's attractive character helped him remain lifelong friends with almost all his commanding officers, except perhaps George Farmer, who was an infamous disciplinarian. Farmer was personally courageous and later died in action, but in a 2-year voyage to the East Indies, with a crew of about 250, on active service in the frigate Seahorse, he ordered no fewer than 300 floggings. Nelson understood the need for discipline and was quite willing to provide it ruthlessly when necessary, but in general he believed that violence was not the way to keep a crew comfortable and efficient. Nelson wrote very little about Farmer, in marked contrast to all the kinder captains he had worked with. Then he caught malaria, and was so ill he was expected to die. Sent home in the frigate Dolphin, he put his recovery down to Captain James Piggott, quote, "whose kindness saved my life." During the long voyage home, in deep depression because of the illness, and feeling he couldn't succeed in his profession, Nelson had an extraordinary experience. In a kind of vision, he saw a brilliant orb before his mind's eye that filled him with a sense of joy and confidence. "Well then," I exclaimed, "I will be a hero." And many times in later years, he would talk to friends about this orb exactly as if it was a real object in front of him. By now, Captain Suckling was controller of the Navy. As soon as Nelson got home in September 1776, Suckling sent him off again as acting 4th Lieutenant in a 64-gun ship on convoy duty from the Channel to Gibraltar. Tough love. But Nelson thrived, and in April 1777 passed his exam as a lieutenant. He was still well under 19 years old, and the lower age limit was supposed to be 20. His subsequent appointment as 2nd Lieutenant in the frigate Lowestoft began another lifelong friendship. The highly experienced Captain William Locker recognised his growing talent, and after just a few days' acquaintance, took him to have his portrait painted, the first definite likeness of Nelson. Heading for the West Indies, Lowestoft was entering a war zone. The American War of Independence was underway, and the frigate soon began capturing prizes, including a schooner which Locker renamed Little Lucy, after his daughter, and kept as a tender to the bigger ship. Here we see Lowestoft in the centre, and 2 very similar schooners, either of which could be Lucy. This became Nelson's first independent command. What a beautiful vessel! The modern schooner Shenandoah built in 1964, shows just why Nelson was so eager to captain Little Lucy. He wrote to Locker saying, "I am most exceedingly obliged for the good opinion you entertain of me," and he addressed Locker as "my most worthy friend." Another deep and lasting friendship took root here with Lieutenant Cuthbert Collingwood. 10 years older than Nelson, yet with only 2 years more seniority, he was stuck in a little sloop of war with an embittered commanding officer, also a lieutenant, who had never progressed to a bigger command. But Collingwood was as devoted to the service as Nelson was, and instead of jealousy, felt relief that a kindred spirit had arrived. Locker fell ill early in 1778, and simultaneously a new commander-in-chief was appointed to the West Indies station, Admiral Peter, later Sir Peter Parker, a former comrade in arms of Captain Suckling. He quickly appointed Nelson as third lieutenant in his 50-gun flagship, HMS Bristol. Parker and his wife came to look on Nelson almost as a son, and in December 1778, Parker promoted him to the rank of Master and Commander, in charge of the brig Badger. This intermediate rank, between lieutenant and captain, was kept for vessels too small to merit both a captain and a sailing master. It required great expertise in navigation, and although it didn't make an officer a captain, it implied he was being considered for that, and it gave him the courtesy title of captain. In this small vessel, Nelson was sent to fend American privateers off from the Mosquito Coast, a 1,000-mile stretch of Central America. Nelson succeeded so well that for the first time in his life he received public thanks from the people he was protecting. When he returned from the patrol, Parker rewarded him with the highest promotion he could give. On 11th June 1779, still aged only 20, Nelson was made post-captain following the accidental death of another captain, and was given the 28-gun frigate Hinchinbrook. Somewhat bizarrely, Nelson couldn't take command of Hinchinbrook at once, but had to take temporary charge of a shore battery of guns. Then, in 1780, when he had his ship, he was ordered to help the army in a plan of its own, aiming to split Spanish America by sending a force up the San Juan River. That's marked here, lower centre with a red dot. He was very doubtful. "How it will turn out, God knows," he wrote to Locker. It turned out disastrously. After a nightmare journey of nearly 70 miles up the river, the invaders encountered a castle and settled in for a siege. It took 11 days, and the besiegers died by dozens. Nelson's malaria returned, along with manchineel poisoning, part paralysis, yellow fever, and dysentery. He only survived because Parker made Collingwood a captain, gave him Hinchinbrook, and recalled Nelson to a bigger ship. Nelson was never able to take command of that ship. He was simply too ill. Once again, he had to come back to England for his health. The gun wharf at Portsmouth was a peaceful place for a sailor to rest en route for home. The same could hardly be said for the raucous joys of Portsmouth Point, just a couple of miles away. Now dominated by the Spinnaker Tower, Gunwharf Quays today is no longer Royal Navy territory, but has been transformed into a fashionable area for shopping and eating. Eventually, Nelson was sent back across the Atlantic, and there met one of the most influential friends he could have, Prince William Henry, son of King George III, serving as a midshipman in Lord Hood's flagship Barfleur. "Captain Nelson," said the prince, "appeared to be the merest boy of a captain I ever beheld. My doubts were, however, removed when Lord Hood introduced me to him. There was something irresistibly pleasing in his address and conversation, and an enthusiasm when speaking on professional subjects that showed he was no common being." The merest boy of a captain? Boyish, yes, but not like a captain? While in England, Nelson returned to John Rigaud, the artist, who had painted his first portrait on Locker's advice, and Rigaud added a captain's insignia. Along with a kind of Central American background, including the fort where Nelson had so nearly died. After America won its War of Independence, and, like many other British officers, Nelson was placed on half pay. He took himself off to Saint-Omer in northern France, intending to try and learn the language. But after only a few weeks, he came quickly back to England. There had been a major political change there. At the age of 24, the same age as Nelson, William Pitt the Younger had been appointed Prime Minister by the King. Nelson's hasty return was because he was inspired briefly to think about a political career for himself. But the Navy had another job for him to do, back across the Atlantic. His new ship, the frigate HMS Boreas, was unusual, being one of a class of 5 frigates built out of fir rather than oak. His primary job with her was also unusual. He had to ferry the chatterbox Lady Hughes, wife of the Commander-in-Chief of the Leeward Islands, and her daughter Rosie out to their new home. English Harbour in Antigua is known nowadays as Nelson's Harbour, aptly so since during this critical period of his life he often based his ship there. Perhaps most astonishing are his youthfulness and the weight of responsibility on his slight shoulders. At the age of 25, he was the most senior officer on station, and unless a more senior officer came out, he was responsible not only for a warship and her crew, but for all naval matters that might affect British interests there. The single most significant was Britain's Navigation Act, which prohibited foreigners from trading freely with British colonies. But the newly independent Americans, who had become foreigners, were doing exactly that, and no one, not even the weak-willed Commander-in-Chief of the Leeward Islands, sought to stop them. On the contrary, the islanders wanted the profitable trades to continue. But American independence was a bit like the Brexit of its day. Eventually, Sir Richard Hughes, the island's Commander-in-Chief, realised that Nelson was right to enforce the Act and bar American trade, and the two men became friends. Others hated him, and had he been less resolute, he could have had an easier life, but in that case he wouldn't have become the brilliant combat commander of later years, seizing the initiative from opponents, daring to trust his own judgment, audaciously ignoring orders, and, by no means least, instilling in his officers and men an unbounded confidence in his care and leadership. When his tour of duty was over, and he came back to England again, it was as a married man. His wife, the widow Fanny Nisbet of Nevis, was famed as the principal beauty of the island, and brought him an instant family in the shape of her young son Josiah. Prince William Henry gave the fatherless woman away, and the newlyweds were certainly in love. But in England they encountered unimagined challenges that gradually eroded their bonds. Nelson unexpectedly found himself out of work. His conscience was clear, and he never understood that his actions in Antigua had caused such difficulties at home that the Admiralty no longer wanted to employ him. Even the King, most shockingly for Nelson, had an unfavourable opinion of him. Every Saturday for 5 years he would walk along this path with a newspaper and a packet of correspondence from London, desperately hoping for a new job. For his wife Fanny, accustomed as she was to tropical warmth, the bitter winters of North Norfolk were extremely hard to tolerate. In April 1790, to their mutual shock, Nelson received a writ for damages of £20,000 from American traders in the West Indies. That, at least, was reassuringly dealt with by the Treasury. During the whole of 1791, there is no direct personal evidence at all for Nelson's life, not a single letter of his own. He must have been sunk in the depths of frustration. It was not until 1793, and the start of his 6th year on the beach, that at last a letter came from the capital. In his own words, post nubila Phoebus. In other words, after clouds, sunshine. All the political signs were for war with revolutionary France, and at last, he wrote, "The Admiralties so smile upon me that really I am as much surprised as when they frowned." Poor Fanny learned the news while mourning the death of her uncle, once the president of Nevis. The 6th anniversary of her second wedding was approaching, and her life had been completely changed, all for the worse. Even her son Josiah was leaving. He was old enough to join Nelson at sea. Seen here in this wonderful painting by Jeff Hunt, Nelson's new command, HMS Agamemnon, 64 guns, was comparatively small, but she sailed very well. She could outsail anything she couldn't outgun, and she could outgun anything she could not outsail. She became Nelson's favourite of all the ships he ever commanded. In her, in 1796, he led the British fleet back into the Mediterranean. And here, our story of the naval influences on young Nelson ends, because, at the age of 38, he had become the influencer. But that, as they say, is another story.
Hi, I'm Dave Winkler here at the World Headquarters of the Naval Historical Foundation here at the Washington Navy Yard. I'm substituting this second Saturday for our Executive Director, Rear Admiral Sonny Masso, who's on the Binnacle list today. We wish him a speedy recovery, and he'll be back here next month for our annual meeting in Leighton Lecture. On behalf of Sonny, as well as our Chairman, Admiral Fallon, and to the directors and staff of the Naval Historical Foundation, welcome to Second Saturday. First, again, I do want to thank our introducer, Director Matt Bergman, for his fine introduction and the financial backing of his firm, Bergman, Draper, Uslin, Udo. Second, a few words about our presenter, Stephen Howarth. Nice presentation. Really enjoyed that. He's the current secretary of the 1805 Club, who was strongly recommended for this little gig here by Captain John Rogard of that same organization and the Naval Order of the U.S. For the book he co-wrote with his father, Nelson, The Immortal Memory. Stephen has been an independent author of history since 1979, 15 major published works on a wide range of subjects, including a rather fine narrative of the U.S. Navy. However, somebody who had the privilege of writing the history of the U.S. Navy Reserve, I really am in great debt to Stephen for his history of the Royal Navy Reserve. His book served as a template for mine. Before we get on with the question and answer portion of the program, I want to welcome our commentators, Andrew Lambert, Fleet Commander Vice Admiral Jeremy Kidd, and a member of our board of directors, retired Admiral James Foggo. I've had the pleasure of meeting and hearing presentations of Professor Lambert in recent years at the World War I Centennial conferences at the Royal Maritime Museum in Greenwich. He is celebrating 2 decades as the Lawton Professor of Naval History in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Author of at least 18 major works and numerous articles, Andrew is contributing to an ongoing American naval renaissance due to the number of Yanks who he has taken under his wing, such as former Director of Naval History and Foundation Director Jerry Hendricks, Deputy Chair of the History Department at the U.S. Naval Academy, B.J. Armstrong, and head of the Hattendorf Center for History at the Naval War College, David Conan, just to mention a few of the Americans that he's been willing to put up with and guide their studies. After we gather Andrew's thoughts on Stephen's presentation, added insights, I will turn it over to Fleet Commander Kidd for his thoughts on Stephen's presentation and how the legacy of Nelson echoes today in the Royal Navy. I first heard from then Captain Kidd, commanding officer of Her Majesty's ship Queen Elizabeth, at a Pickle Night Dinner at the New York Yacht Club. It's a wonderful event, co-hosted by Joe Callow and Sally McAlwith on behalf of the American Friends of the Royal Naval Museum. The event actually commemorates the arrival of the sloop HMS Pickle with the news of the great victory at Trafalgar and the tragic news of Nelson's passing. I strongly commend it. I understand that they're shooting for a November 12th date this year, and it should be a good affair. Needless to say, at that Pickle Night Dinner, I was very impressed with the then Captain Kidd's grasp of the history of the Royal Navy in the age of sail, and I'm delighted he could join us. And then finally, I'll ask Admiral Foggo, who crowned his career as the commander of United States Naval Forces Europe, Africa, and thus he has an appreciation of the special relationship, to also comment on Stephen's presentation and discuss how Nelson's leadership qualities may apply to our Navy. With that, over to Professor Lambert.
Thank you very much, Dave. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you from over the other side of the pond. And to thank Stephen for his splendid presentation, which is, I think, set up some of the things that I would like to just build on that. What we're looking at is a very early example of a professionally shaped career. Maurice Suckling didn't just take his sister's son on board, he took him on as a surrogate son. He had no sons of his own, so Nelson became his son. And as one of the leading officers in the contemporary Royal Navy, he knew everybody. By the time he died in the late 1770s, he was actually running the Navy's administrative organization. He was the controller of the Navy Board. He was in charge of almost everything to do with building, supplying, and maintaining ships. So if he didn't know everybody in the Navy, he knew almost everybody, and he knew all the right people. And that becomes very, very important in Nelson's career. So Nelson's career is an amazing opportunity set before him by his uncle, who's at the peak of his powers, at the height of his expertise, and with this amazing patronage network around him, he knows everybody. Nelson has to pick up that opportunity. Someone else might well have failed the task. Nelson doesn't. He grabs everything that Suckling gives him. He picks up and builds on all of those experiences. He conquers his seasickness, and remember, Nelson is profoundly seasick throughout his entire career. So he's not a natural born mariner. He's not comfortable at sea like some of us. When he gets to sea and the war breaks out in the 1770s, the war with America, but also it's a war with France and Spain, Nelson has a model, not just of naval leadership from his uncle, but also the very definition of a British hero. And it's James Wolfe, the army general who captured Quebec in 1759 and died in the moment of victory. Wolfe's battle on the plains of Abraham outside Quebec is a defining moment in British culture. And Nelson picks that up and he remembers that to the end of his days. There's a fabulous picture of the death of Wolfe painted by the American artist Benjamin West. And Nelson told West that it would be worth dying to be remembered like that. And West would paint the death of Nelson 3 times before he absolutely got it right with a sculpture. Why does Wolfe matter? Well, that crazy expedition up the San Juan River that Stephen told you about, the orders from that came from George Dawling, the governor of Jamaica, who was on the plains of Abraham and is in Benjamin West's picture. So Nelson was given his orders by one of James Wolfe's right-hand men. That's as close as Holy Writ. So he took that on, and he took it on with enormous enthusiasm. Captain Nelson is a man obsessed with duty. He's obsessed with defending the establishment because he's a son of the church. His greatest challenge is going to come from an atheist Republican regime in France. It will be not a war between nations, but a war between ideologies, between cultures. Nelson is on the side of the Constitution, the church, and the existing order. And when he gets to the Mediterranean in the Agamemnon, just where Stephen left him, he sets himself a new task. He's now the captain of a line of battleship in Britain's Mediterranean fleet. But he's not content. He wants to be the admiral. And he's going to become the admiral by studying great admirals. And the great admiral leading that fleet is Admiral Sir Samuel Lord Hood, who, after Nelson, is perhaps the greatest seagoing genius in the history of the Royal Navy. But Nelson learns his business by working out what the admiral is doing and why he's doing it. And the thing that Hood teaches him, by example, Hood doesn't tell him anything, he lets him work it out for himself. Hood makes it very clear that the greatest gift of a naval commander is the political courage to disobey their orders when they know they are right. And this will be the defining character of Nelson's leadership. He is not prepared to do as he's told if he knows there is a better way that will produce superior results. And he has the confidence to back his own judgment over and over again. Even when people criticize him, he knows that he's right and he's prepared to back his judgment. Whether you can lead like that in the 21st century is a question we might want to think about later. But certainly Nelson in the 18th century takes leadership to a new level, because after 1793, Britain is not fighting a war with France, it's fighting a war with an alien ideology. And the end of that war will only come when either the French or the British regimes are overthrown and destroyed. So this is an existential war, it's a total conflict. And Nelson knows that Britain will only succeed if it wins at sea and preserves its security. So thank you very much.
Okay, on to Fleet Commander Kidd. I want to get his thoughts on how the legacy of Nelson echoes today within the Royal Navy. Following on with that comment from Professor Lambert about judgment and self-confidence, I think are those traits that have passed on over the centuries.
Yeah, thanks, David, and a very good afternoon to you all again from this side of the pond. It's a real privilege to be with you today as the current Royal Navy's Fleet Commander. So in some ways, Nelson's successor times about 15 times. I find it an extremely emotive, personal, and rather emotional subject, particularly for where I am currently leading the Royal Navy Fleet. I love Stephen's picture of a Lord Nelson pub in Suffolk there. There are indeed 66 pubs in the United Kingdom called Lord Nelson. If there's ever a barometer of success in life, certainly in this country, it's how many pubs are named after you. So well done, Lord Nelson. So what does this man, this immortal memory, mean to the Royal Navy of today? And I dare say there's some extrapolation across the United States Navy. Well, some say it's a long time ago. You know, some say that the Nelson spell is perhaps broken. Well, I can tell you now, certainly from my Navy, that's absolute rubbish. He is still revered. He's still a complete talisman. And I think the major factor for me is that in our business, in any Navy's business, it's about taking violence to the enemy. Sometimes people don't like talking about that nowadays in this nice, decadent 21st century world, but we remain in a pretty dangerous world, that said. And I don't think we've pressed the pause button on some fairly major state-on-state fighting in the future, sadly. So Nelson, for me, remains perhaps the very personification of the culture of winning, something that Andrew picked up there. I remember very luckily, a number of years ago now, when I was about to take command of my first frigate, HMS Monmouth, I had a lecture from Commodore Jeremy Larkin, who by that stage had been retired from the Navy for some time, but he'd been the captain of HMS Fearless down in the Falklands, again, mentioned by Stephen earlier. And I said to him, I said, how did you feel when you were driving into San Carlos water that night, expecting to come under some significant fire from the enemy? We didn't really understand completely where the enemy were, but you were driving your ship in there, packed the gunwales with Royal Marines, 40 commando embarked. And he said to me, Jerry, he said, that's a great question. He said, as I sat in my seat as the captain, driving in at 8 knots, not quite knowing what the enemy's reaction was going to be. He said, I tell you now, he said, it might sound odd. He said, but I felt the presence of Nelson on my shoulder. Now, I don't know whether that's him in hindsight, but I tell you now, for me, it probably captures the fact that Nelson for us remains an inspiration. He may be a demigod, but as a naval officer, he had all the ingredients that make up someone who became a very, very special naval fighter: a sense of duty, know-how, courage, and perhaps he was one of the greatest courageous naval officers we've ever experienced. 120 times he went into action. He had many wounds, but he stood with his men all the time. He never, ever backed down. He was a great seaman. He'd been at sea since he was 12 or 13. He was a master of relationships. And of course, he had that Nelson leadership touch. Indeed, his men cried at the news of his death. If there's ever a mark of someone who's loved as a leader, it's when your own men cry at your deathbed. Of course, he had his faults. He was vain. He was very ambitious. But ultimately, he was extremely liked. In the Navy, it's often said that it is better to have an unpopular commander who wins battles than to be led by a likable loser. Well, I think we can safely say that Nelson was both. He was a popular commander and he was a winner. He understood the lower deck, something I try and get my captains to do nowadays. And people talk about the Nelson touch. Well, I always say to my COs, it was about the Nelson's embrace. He embraced his duty. He embraced the crown. He embraced his faith. He embraced his men, and he embraced the sea. And all of it was directed at the end of the day to winning in battle. I make many Trafalgar Night speeches, as Dave just pointed out. And I remember anchoring HMS Queen Elizabeth in New York Harbor a few years ago, about 9 or 10 cables south of Manhattan. And I anchored on purpose right in the same spot that Nelson used to anchor his ship in the 1780s, a very special place. But I'm going to finish off now by just reminding people of my famous, my favorite passage from the perhaps there's no better insight into a man than for someone who lives in intimate closeness with another human being. The following extract from the diary of Reverend Alexander Scott, Nelson's chaplain, and the man who cradled Nelson as he died, said, "Let the country mourn their hero. I grieve for the loss of the most fascinating companion I ever conversed with, the greatest and the simplest of men, one of the nicest and the most innocent, interesting beyond all, on shore, in public, and even in private life. Men are not always themselves and put on their behavior with their clothes, but if you live with a man on board a ship for years, if you're continually with him in his cabin, your mind will soon find out how to appreciate him. I could tell you forever the qualities of this beloved man. I have not shed a tear for years before the 21st of October, and since, whenever alone, I am like a child, setting aside his heroism when I think what an affectionate, fascinating little fellow he was, how kind and modest his manners, I become stupid for grief for what I and the country have lost." Well, everyone, that's my pitch summed up neatly there by Reverend Scott. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fleet Commander Kidd. And let me turn it over to somebody who recently was stationed over in Europe, Admiral Foggo, who I think can expound on the influence of Nelson on our side of the Atlantic.
Good morning. I hope you all can hear me. And Andrew, if you can, give me a thumbs up. All right, great. It's a pleasure to be here today.
I believe you're muted,
for
sir.
a number of reasons. First of all, I'd like to thank my friend, Fleet Admiral Jerry Kidd, from joining us from Portsmouth, England, to be part of this celebration of Nelson today. Secondly, I've always been a great admirer of Nelson, and I would normally do this kind of thing in my study upstairs, but I'm down in the foyer of my house. Is there a problem with the audio? No sound. Okay. All right, Andrew, I'm going to take a quick break here and swap to another system. So let me sign out, and I'll sign back in a minute.
Can't hear you now, Dave.
That's because I was muted. Okay. Were we able to hear Admiral Foggo?
I could hear him.
Not me.
Okay. Admiral Foggo, could you, I guess, could you repeat your remarks, please?
I think he's gone upstairs to reconnect, so hopefully he'll be with us. I think he's using a different machine.
All right. In that case, Stephen, do you have some, while we're waiting for our Admiral to come back on, Stephen, do you have some, I guess, counter or comments on the comments?
Well, actually, I would say that it was really delightful to hear Admiral Kidd, especially with that apposite quote from Scott. It's something that everybody who studies Nelson should always remember. And of course, it's always a great pleasure to hear Andrew again, who's a man I've known for many years and look forward to many more, even after today. I think it'll all go well. You, Andrew, thank you so much for saying that I put forward something on which you could build, because that's about all I was trying to do. And of course, you built on it most capably indeed. I learn something every time I listen to you. In fact, I learn something every time I listen to anybody, really, but perhaps you especially. So as far as I'm concerned, it's been an extraordinary pleasure to be as a part of this. And I should say, actually, that the technical aspects so far have been perfectly managed. And this is just a little hiccup, and I'm quite willing to carry on talking as long as you like. Might pass over to Andrew or Jerry, but...
Okay, let me start with some of the questions.
Yeah.
And the first one I have here, I'm going to go with one from John Rogard from the 1805 Club. Now, again, the 1805 Club, of course, as you recognize from the date, that's the victory at Trafalgar. So it's a very Nelsonian organization with members on both sides of the Atlantic. And, you know, John's question is Nelson is memorialized for Trafalgar, but is the Battle of the Nile really his greatest victory? Is more, or is just because Trafalgar is more consequential?
Well, if I can jump straight in there, the first thing I'd like to say is that John Rodgard is indeed a long-standing friend of mine as a member of the 1805 Club. In fact, he is our very newly elected new chairman, and he is the first American chairman of this international organization. I am a past chairman, currently the secretary, and I want to emphasize that we, despite the date, 1805, we do not focus exclusively on Nelson by any means. We study the naval history of the whole of the Georgian era, that is to say 1714 to 1837. Plus, we are very, very inclusive, internationally speaking. We study the American Navy, the Swedish Navy, any other Navy of importance in that period, and obviously publish our researches and results. I would certainly commend the listeners to our annual journal, which is called the Trafalgar Chronicle, and it really is the go-to volume for new naval research on the Georgian era, no matter from what country. So that is my big plug for the 1805 Club. And may I add in a little plug that is more Nelsonian, which is a baby that we created called the Trafalgar Way. The Trafalgar Way is a separate but closely related organization which commemorates in hugely creative fashion the ride of Lieutenant Lapenotiere, who brought the news of Trafalgar Nelson's death from Falmouth to the Admiralty in London. Please do check out the websites of both these organizations. And now, Dave, would remind me of your question, please.
Okay. Well, yeah, going back to John, I was asking about the Battle of the Nile versus Trafalgar.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. I think it would be hard to say that the Battle of the Nile was not Nelson's most astounding and influential battle. The thing that Andrew mentioned this earlier, how Nelson was completely out of touch, naturally, from London, and how he had to rely entirely upon his own experience, his own initiative, his own intelligence, and in a wonderful hunt for the French fleet, which had escaped from their headquarters in Toulon, he had to work out where they were going to. It was Alexandria in Egypt, and when he decided this must be where they were going to, then he sailed his ships down there so quickly that they overtook the French and arrived there and thought, oh my goodness, nobody's here. So he decided he'd got it wrong and began to hunt all around the Eastern Mediterranean again until eventually he fell in with a Greek merchantman, got some intelligence from that source, and went down to Abu Qir Bay, as it turned out, where the French were at anchor in the evening. During the weeks when he'd been hunting around Eastern Mediterranean, he had so carefully taught and indoctrinated his captains, who were, of course, already very experienced men, that when they went in to Abu Qir Bay, they all knew precisely what to do, and he did not have to give any orders at all. And I would love to talk at great length about this. I find it a very, very inspiring battle. Trafalgar was the sort of cherry on the cake, but undoubtedly the Nile was where that cake was baked.
Professor Lambert, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for that, Dave. Thank you, Stephen. The Nile is the battle that makes Nelson a god. It's after that battle that he's compared with the heroes of Homer. You can't go beyond that. So this is where Nelson becomes the superstar of the age. And it is a battle that changes the course of history. The French are winning when Nelson sails into Abu Qir Bay. And by the time the sun comes up the next morning, they're losing. And a grand alliance will assemble over the next 6 months that will take the war back to the French. And they will have to refight their way across Europe all over again. So this is the battle that transforms the world. It's the battle that transforms Sir Horatio Nelson into a superstar. It arrives just at the right moment in time to boost the national morale. It changes the domestic politics. The opposition is getting ready to overthrow the government. Nelson's victory changes all of that. The opposition are completely discomfited. And Nelson comes home nearly 3 years later, the most famous man in the world. It's worth remembering that in his lifetime, Nelson was famous in Japan as well as in Europe. And in those days, being known in Japan was a little more difficult. Trafalgar is hugely important, but it doesn't really change very much. The British command the ocean, and Nelson's decisions at Trafalgar are about taking that one opportunity to wipe out the enemy fleet that just might cause problems. So it's a different problem that he's solving. And Copenhagen should never be forgotten, because Copenhagen secures access to the Baltic. And with that come all of the naval stores that you need to build and maintain and run your fleet. And Copenhagen shows, I think, the critical thing with Nelson: he never fights the same battle twice. He works out the strategic and political ambitions of the mission. He works out how to win the battle most effectively to secure those ends. At the Nile, it's easy: wipe these people out. At Trafalgar, there's not long enough to wipe them out. There's a storm coming. He settles for 20 out of 33. At Copenhagen, he just has to persuade the Danes to abandon their alliance with Russia, Prussia, and Sweden. So he controls the battle at Copenhagen by signal right the way through. Nobody does anything at Copenhagen without Nelson's direct order. At the Nile and at Trafalgar, Nelson is able to release his captains to use the maximum amount of force to secure the tactical result that will serve the strategic end. But the strategic end at Copenhagen is so different. It's political, and it's not about defeating the Danes. It's about persuading them very gently not to be on the wrong side of the argument. So it's just enough violence to win the battle and secure the political ambition. So he's a thinking admiral. His great contemporary Napoleon fought the same battle 100 times, and he lost the last one. So he's removed from the list. Nelson never did this. He's always thinking about the political, the strategic context, and suiting the battle to the moment in time. And that's why the Nile is the greatest of them. But if we look at them all, we can see that he's greater as a commander than any of his battles. And any situation that he was placed in, he would have found the right answer to achieve the objective of the state and to improve the command of the sea.
I'm going to throw it over to Fleet Commander Kidd. Coming up through the Royal Navy to the various schools, how are these battles studied? And how did you use the lessons to inform yourself?
Yeah, Dave, can I just very quickly pick up on Andrew and Stephen's excellent sort of just answer there quickly on the Nile, because I think it's a really important part of Nelson's background. We talked about the strategic implications of the Nile, how it, cemented Britain's domination for that war, but also the fact that it was a fulcrum of confidence. It was a point at which the Royal Navy really recognised the fact that they would swing it with the French. But I'd like to make the point that not only was Nelson a thinking admiral and brilliantly could appreciate the geostrategic position, he also kept his operations simple. Yet on the back of that, his tactical considerations were excellent. I always said that fighting power, the ability to lean violence on the enemy, comes from three things. Fighting power is moral, physical, and conceptual. He had the ships and the guns, absolutely. He certainly had the simple tactics, the concepts, if you like. But critically here, he had the moral component. And this was where we see Nelson come back as a hero, the fleet really beginning to believe in Nelson as a talisman. And I think my view is that when you mix the heady mixture of confidence and competence, you deliver a winning formula. And I think the Nile was the fulcrum around suddenly this was a very, very serious fighting admiral. And I think Trafalgar, of course, we know the strategic implications of that. So I think for me, to answer your question, Dave, as you're going up through the Royal Navy, is there anyone that we've studied more? Probably not. Is there anyone that is shows us the way of warfare? Probably not. And I think we're so lucky to have so many superb academics, not least Andrew and Stephen, who write so brilliantly upon him that allows me and my officers and my ratings to study Nelson. And I think, as I said before, the fact he lived, 250 years ago, he went to sea, all the lessons that he showed us resonate completely today in the modern warfare of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice response. I want to change the tack of questions here about, sailing in the age of sail. As far as I'm going to combine a few questions here about Nelson's. We heard about him caring about his sailors. Contribution to individual sailor and overall fleet health, and what foods would have been on board and when Nelson served in the Navy. Talk about the diet at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I can jump in with a.
Yeah.
It was basically pretty disgusting by our standards. But on the other hand, there was plenty of it, and it was much more reliable than you were likely to get on shore. If you were a sailor, or the, as it were, social equivalent of a sailor, that class of person on shore, then you could not be certain of getting 3 square meals a day as part of your work. And of course, the term square meal, incidentally, as you probably know, comes from the square wooden platters that they used. But I do have a favorite quotation which I'd like to read to you. A 12-year-old boy who joined around about the same time as Nelson wrote home saying, "We live on beef, which quite makes your throat cold in eating it." It had been preserved, owing to the maggots, which are very cold when you eat them, like calf's foot jelly or blancmange, being very fat indeed. And he added, "I do like this life very much."
Professor Lambert, would you like to add on to that?
I can add a little. I can't match the poetry of that, but I'll certainly add some more prosaic things. The main foodstuffs are salted meats, mostly beef and pork, dried peas, which are then soaked and cooked up, and hard tack, essentially some often referred to as bread, but actually it's just a very thick, solid biscuit. These are things that last on board on a long voyage, and the preservation technologies of the day are restricted to baking it very hard or putting a lot of salt in it. Canning is going to come in just after the Nelson period. We know that officers sometimes had slightly better rations. They would take some livestock with them on the ship for as long as it lasted. They would milk the cows and eventually eat them, and they'd take some sheep along too. But fresh food was critical. And Nelson and his chaplain, Alexander Scott, who Stephen mentioned earlier, put a huge effort into getting fresh supplies. So in Nelson's last command, the 2 years he spent in the Mediterranean, they were getting fresh vegetables out of Barcelona, as long as Spain was neutral. They were getting vegetables, and particularly lemons, out of Sicily, some of them coming from Nelson's estate at Bronte in Sicily, because Nelson understood that fit, healthy crewmen produce better results in battle. Keeping your men fit and healthy is a critical part of the all-round responsibility of an officer. Nelson took that very, very seriously. Alexander Scott was an intelligence operator, but a lot of that intelligence was logistics focused. He worked every possible angle to get fresh food. He gave church silver to Sardinian churches in exchange for access to the Sardinian food market. So Nelson looks after his people because he's not going to get many more. Sailors are short. And if he looks after the ones he's got, they will be even more effective in battle than they would be otherwise. So the Royal Navy is feeding its men as best it can with the available technology. It's also obsessed with keeping its ships clean, because that cuts down on the risk of disease. The contrast with French and Spanish ships, which were not clean, and Russian ships, which were abominably filthy in every possible description, is very obvious. And the mortality rates of those navies reflect the cleanliness of their ships. This is something the Royal Navy learned early, and it's something that's been preserved right down to this day. It really does make a difference. If you can set the right agenda on board the ship, you can keep the conditions under control, you can reduce the spread of disease, you can reduce the spread of those diseases you get on dirty ships, typhus in particular, things that are spread by dirty bodies and dirty clothes. So men were flogged for not being clean. Men were flogged for not cleaning their clothes. This is sensible. You build a culture where cleanliness is important. The last thing to say about food in the age of fighting sail is no captain with any brains would ever take his men away from their dinner unless it was an emergency. So it's either storm, shipwreck, or battle. There is no other excuse for interfering with the men while they're eating. And they take quite a lot of time, because hard biscuits and scorbutic mouths with few teeth in them are not an easy match. So you need to give them plenty of time to eat this stuff. There's a lot of it, as Stephen said, but it's not easy to eat.
Let me pass it on to the fleet commander. Are there any culinary traditions that pass on to the Royal Navy today?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Well, I'm not going to add anything to both of those excellent answers. All I would say is that, the Royal Navy really learned about the power of food and victuals. Really, it was Samuel Pepys in 1677, where I've got a passage here, and he said, "Seamen love their bellies above everything else. Make any abatement from them in the quantity or agreeableness of the victuals is to provoke them in the tenderest spot, and render them disgusted with the king's service than any other hardship." All I'll say to that is nothing has changed. On my ships and all my commands, I've had frigates and aircraft carriers and goodness knows what. Meal times are still sacrosanct. Good food is still sacrosanct. And I tell you now, if the chefs don't deliver, they get the hardest time of anyone on board. So all I'm going to say to you, Dave, is I don't know, probably the same in the US Navy, but certainly the Royal Navy, food remains really important. Although the only thing that has changed is in Samuel Pepys' time, of course, every man got a gallon of beer daily and 1 pound of biscuits. That's certainly not the case today. Over.
Excellent. Now, I hear that the audience was able to hear Admiral Foggo's comments. For some reason, I had some technical feedback. But is the Admiral back? And would he be willing to talk a little bit about Chow in the U.S. Navy and how traditions have come across this side of the pond?
So I think you must be signaling me to try again. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. My understanding is that the audience could hear me, but some of my colleagues that were on the panel could not. So let me just kick it off with about 5 minutes of remarks here. I've shifted location, sadly, because sitting in my foyer, just above my head, I was going to show you the handmade model of Victory that was actually crafted by a British Special Forces officer in his retirement. And it was obtained by me. I purchased it through the Victory Services Club in London and brought it back to Naples, Italy on British Air, amazingly in a box in the cargo hold. And it was completely intact when I got there. And I attributed that to the luck of Nelson and the fact that he was sailing Victory home to Lady Hamilton, whom he first met in Naples, Italy. The second item I was going to show you was behind me in that other room is an 1876 lithograph, original, only a few hundred made, of Nelson's death on Victory with Hardy. And I had the pleasure of serving overseas in Naples, where Nelson spent some of his time, and also in Mons, Belgium. And those are two match prints with another great British officer, Lord Wellington, in the top in the Victory at Waterloo, where I lived for a while at Shape headquarters. The other thing I wanted to show you is I've heard Admiral Jerry Kidd hit the gavel during Trafalgar Night, and I actually have a piece of wood, recycled wood from Victory's hull that we use for our own Trafalgar and Robert Burns nights here in the United States. So lots of history there and lots of connection to Nelson. You asked me to talk about leadership and how Nelson's lessons have impacted the United States Navy. And let me just say that significant impact. You know, we learned how to fight from the Royal Navy. Nelson was one who was always planning and always meeting with his captains, or his band of brothers, as he called them, to compare notes. He had several dinners with his captains, and he inspired not only the leaders of his fleet, but also the sailors of his fleet with his personal demeanor and his dedication to the crown and to England. He was an expert at the use of agility and speed. His frigates were the scouts, and the British men of war would come in and find, fix, and finish the enemy in battle. He was quick to maneuver and take advantage of things like copper on the hull, which gave him the advantage of speed. He loved a broadside. And as we saw at Trafalgar, breaking the line with Collingwood allowed him to come in and rake the French and the Spanish ships, not just broadside to broadside, but from stern to bow, which was devastating in that type of warfare. He loved gun drills, and in the United States Navy, even in the submarine force, we use that term. Gun drills, loading a torpedo tube, firing a torpedo tube or a water slug, and training our crews to get fast, because the first to fire and the sustained fire over time is the ship that's going to win. There was never any doubt what Nelson would do in a tactical situation in the minds of his captains, because they spent so much time with him talking about it and his time training them. And that's one of the things that is important for us in the United States Navy. We must train our reliefs, and he was excellent at that. He inspired men to do their duty, and doing your duty was closing with the enemy and fighting the enemy. And they all knew what to do in places like the Nile or in Trafalgar. Another book that I have on my bookshelf is called The Nelson's Portraits. A couple of words about that. Nelson's portraits are oil, watercolor, and charcoal prints or pencil sketches of him throughout his life. The author is Richard Walker. I picked it up at the Royal Navy Museum. And what it chronicles is the change in the physicality of Nelson throughout his career. Life was tough in the Royal Navy. You've heard that from many of the historians this morning. And Nelson was at best about 5'5", and sometimes the term diminutive was used. It may have been he may have been diminutive in his physical stature, but he was not in his command of the fleet and his inspiration of his officers. Over time, you heard from Stephen Howarth, he suffered many, many ills. Malaria, yellow fever, some thought he had tuberculosis. Recurring fevers came back throughout his life, and he had chest pains. He was hit with shrapnel in his right eye at Calvi, and later complained to his wife that he could not see out of that eye, probably retinal damage. At the Battle of Santa Cruz, he was hit in the arm with a musket ball and ultimately lost that arm. And in the book, there is a section that talks about the amputation and how miserably horrible that was under the conditions of the time, and the recovery that took over 3 months, but still pained him for the rest of his life. A year later, at the Battle of the Nile, he was hit by a piece of language. And I had to go and look that up in my book, Jack's Beat, that the Admiral Blount from the commander of Marcom gave me. You know, something that was used, an iron piece that was used to try to foil or rake the enemy's sails. A flap of skin went back on his head, blood everywhere, and he actually told people he thought he was dead. But he was stitched up by the surgeon and put back in action. You know, any one of those wounds today would have taken an officer out of the line and out of action. But Nelson sailored on and fought on to inspire his men. The last thing I will tell you is I was searching for interesting things about Nelson. I found, of all things, an article from the Harvard Business Review recently about Nelson, on how Nelson inspires, or his inspiration transcends not only space and time, but professions. And so this author, Christopher Zook, wrote a piece on leadership about Nelson called The Great Respectable Leader. I want to tell you 3 things about it. The first thing he said is that by projecting his principles of decision-making and his strategy out to the front line, Nelson created a faster and more adaptable Royal Navy that regularly overwhelmed larger enemies, far larger enemies. Secondly, Zook opines that in today's business world, companies try to give themselves too many strategic and organizational options as possible. They don't delegate. Leaders in business are making it unconsciously more complex for their organizations to succeed. It's a trend that is slowly killing them. And in the final analysis, Zook says, what emerged from the study of Nelson was his emotional intelligence, and the fact that the most successful leaders of the future will be those like Nelson, who can cut their distance to the front line through 3 key traits: the ability to be authentic, empathy with the customer and the front line, and true self-awareness. And that obviously is not just the makings of a great naval officer, because history shows us it was, but also the makings of a great leader, whether it's in the military or in business. So I will stop there. Thank you for your indulgence, and I regret any technical problems that occurred earlier, and I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to show you. Thanks for being here today.
Does anybody on the panel have any comments on what Admiral Foggo just said?
No, that's very good. No, that was excellent. Absolutely excellent. It's you know, for a historian, it's always interesting to get the practitioner's view of this, because we end up having this conversation because most of us in my line of work end up in defense education and in civilian education. And it's always important to remember that those are two different audiences, and they're asking different questions, and the end state for them is very different. And that voice of this is what we do as well is a really important one, and it keeps us grounded when we're talking to civilian audiences, talking to undergraduates who have far less access to this kind of experience. And that's been, I think, one of the real standout features of my career, that being able to talk to these two very different audiences gives you different points of focus. And so the answer to all of the questions, there's a history answer, but there's also a today answer. And as long as those two answers are connected, and we're making sure that we're using the history effectively, because all great commanders are aware that they're not the first great commander. They're all aware that before them others have commanded. And commanding people in battle, there's a synergy about that. We can strip away a lot of the details, but it's about the ability to lead people and to persuade them to do things that they wouldn't normally do in a constructive and cohesive way. This isn't an armed mob rushing off to have some fun. This is disciplined, organized, controlled use of power and violence. And as Admiral Kidd has said, that's what it's about. And getting people to do the extraordinary thing isn't just about shouting and yelling and pointing. And as Nelson demonstrated, being there in the place where everybody could see really mattered. At Trafalgar, he was standing in the most dangerous place on the ship, in the ship that was leading the battle. So the most dangerous ship to be on, the most dangerous place to be in, and his chances of getting hit were very, very high. One of his frigate captains, Henry Blackwood, said, "My lord, why don't you come and command the battle from my frigate outside the firing line? You won't be at risk. You'll be able to see the whole battle and direct it with greater acuity from that standpoint." Nelson just laughed at him. This was ridiculous. Nelson's leadership was up front, leading by example. He had to be there. He had to be exactly where the men could see him. If he left the ship, the fighting spirit of the fleet would have dissolved. The fleet would have been half as effective at best. The enemy would have been defeated, but it would have been a very poor return. 1 or 2 would have been taken, not 20. Nelson knew what he was doing, and he knew what it cost. And he's talked about this. He said, "I've been wounded 100 times in the King's service." And remember, in those great portraits, Nelson's empty sleeve is pinned right across the front of his jacket. He's saying, "Look at this. I know I'm a lord and I've got 3 gold medals for being in great battles, but it cost me. I paid a price for this. And the price of glory is not just a bit of effort. It's going to hurt. So be aware of that. If you want to do like I did, follow that example." And remember, his hero is James Wolfe, the man who died in the hour of victory. And there's something ironic about the fact that he too dies in the moment of victory in his last battle. Down in the orlop, struggling for breath, he's drowning in his own blood. And he's hanging on in there because he wants to know what the score is. He wants to know that they've absolutely won the battle. And my reading of it is he knew they'd taken or destroyed 14 of the enemy before he died. And I suspect that with that, he was content. It's clear that he made some kind of superhuman effort to stay alive beyond the point he should have died, because he was desperate to know that his battle plan, his leadership had been vindicated He wanted to know what was going to happen. And that just kept him going long enough to hear that final score.
Okay, I'm going to ask one final question as an opportunity also for final comment from our guest commentators and Stephen. Is 100 years from now, do you think Nelson will be more popular or less popular? That's from Tom Duffy. So thanks for that question. Let's start with Fleet Commander Kidd.
Yeah, I think it's that's an interesting question. My personal view is that absolutely. I think we've all understood that there is absolute direct and modern relevance to all the qualities, attributes, and leadership that Nelson so brilliantly portrayed throughout his professional life. And going back to Andrew's point, that the culture of winning that Nelson is accredited to for the Royal Navy's future successes, and ever since, quite frankly, can all be pinned, or at least in our folklore, is pinned back to Nelson. And I think that extrapolating into the future is an assured thing. There's too much on him. He's not a demigod. He is absolutely seen as human flesh and blood. But I doubt there's going to be another Nelson, and I think he'll remain unique in our memory, and I think he'll remain unique in the inspiration that he gives us. And I didn't catch Jamie Foggo's words because I couldn't hear him, but if there's ever a man that personified the power of the band of brothers and making the right decision in a courageous way to win, then it's going to be Nelson. So for me, will he be as famous in 100 years? Absolutely yes. And I think we won't be around, sadly. But I was around in the Solent when we celebrated Trafalgar 200 in 2005, and I'm very damn sure the Royal Navy will be an anchor again in the Solent for Trafalgar 300.
Admiral Foggo, do you have thoughts on that?
Thank you. As I understand the question, will Nelson still be as popular or notable 100 years from now? And I think the answer to that question is yes. And it depends on distinguished historians to keep the memory alive. I was struck when I found that Harvard Business Review by Christopher Zook that I quoted earlier today, written in 2012, 107 years after Nelson's death on Victory. And I wonder in 2105, on the 200th anniversary of Nelson, will we still be talking about him? Yes, we will, as long as we continue to champion that kind of leadership, not just in our navies, but in our lives, in our businesses, and that is support and delegation of authority, confidence in the people that run our organizations, and an ability to impart those lessons learned that made Nelson the great leader that he was, and to train our reliefs, as I said. And that's a very popular thing, or popular mantra in the submarine force of the United States Navy. Most recently, the sailing of the Strike Group 21 with HMS Queen Elizabeth that Admiral Kidd commanded and hosted me on twice is a testament to the leadership of Lord Nelson. And I am a friend of young Jellicoe, the grandson of Lord Jellicoe, Nick Jellicoe. He writes many books on the Battle of Jutland. We've talked about this and the memory of those great battles. I'm not sure that we will have more decisive battles at sea like Jutland or Trafalgar, perhaps on a smaller scale, and perhaps more in cyber and space. But as Nick Jellicoe has said, we must keep those memories alive so that young people who are walking through Trafalgar Square understand, when they see that person on top of the statue, the pillar in Trafalgar, they understand who he is and what it meant to the freedom of the people that he defended. Likewise, the same thing for the smaller statues of Jellicoe and Beatty. And this is why history is so important, because we learn the lessons of history so that we don't have to relearn them in battles or conflicts again. Nelson brings a huge body of learning, leadership, and literature to the table. And I thank everybody that contributed to this today, especially Admiral Jerry Kidd, who was so busy with CSG-21 deployment out there. And I bet his phone is ringing off the hook. So thanks for the opportunity to participate. And I do believe we'll still be talking about Nelson in a forum like this 100 years from now.
Okay, over to Professor Lambert.
Great, thank you, Dave. Yes, we will. Ever since Nelson's time, different countries around the world have said, look, this is our Nelson. And of course, there is only one Nelson. There is only one Royal Navy. And Nelson is the defining genius of the business of naval command. That isn't a competition. It's a done deal. So when the United States Navy went from being a small navy of cruisers and frigates and began to build a large ocean-going battle fleet, its greatest historian, Admiral Mahan, wrote a very good biography of Nelson to teach American naval officers what they were going to have to do when they commanded great fleets at a distance from the American coast and had the kinds of responsibility that Nelson faced. So he's a teaching tool just for the Royal Navy, but for all navies. He's an example of what naval command can be, how effective that can be. So he's been used as a template. He's an icon. He's instantly recognizable. His slightly old-fashioned dress of knee breeches and a tricorn hat, it just works. He's become emblematic. And he stands on a column in the very heart of London, in Trafalgar Square, to remind us that Britain is a great maritime power. It still is. Some things don't change. The nature of the state, the relationship between the Navy and the state, is celebrated right at the heart of the capital city, in a space midway between the city where all the money is made, Westminster where the political decisions are taken, and right next door to the National Gallery, where the cultural artifacts that identify the country hang, not least J.M.W. Turner's great picture of the Fighting Temeraire, the ship that followed the victory into battle at Trafalgar. So he's right in the heart of British culture. He's right in the heart of naval history and the command culture of navies going forward. So I suspect that, yes, we will all be there in spirit at least. I was there in 2005 on the Solent too, and it was a truly awe-inspiring moment to see the navies of the world come to commemorate this event. Not just the Royal Navy, but the French Navy, the Spanish Navy, the United States Navy, and even, bless them, the Russian Navy. They were all there because it matters to all of them. Thank you. You've dropped out now, Dave.
Yeah, yes, let me give the final word to our presenter, Stephen.
Thank you, Dave. Well, I too was there in the Solent on that ever memorable evening in 2005. I was so impressed by everything I saw, of course, from our own ships, Royal Navy, to the fact that so many ships from other navies were present too. Personally, I am as internationalist as possible, but I do think that for an island nation, obviously, a navy remains vital today. Now, whether we will have one in Britain in 100 years from now, I'm not going to predict, but I believe we will. And I believe that not only we, but other people still, nations around the world, will continue to remember Nelson. I'd like to pick up on something that Andrew said, which is so important, that there's the personal story and there's the career story. And in the career story, then Nelson is a fabulous, possibly unique example of how to do it. And the personal story is so unusual as well. Everything from his very humble beginnings to his heroic death at the climax of battle, and of course to his devotion to faith, to the system, if you like, that he believed in, the monarchical system, as opposed to the atheist republican system. That's him and his time. And of course, his one huge love affair with Emma that transformed his life and possibly made him more relatable, actually, to many people. But the personal story and the career story come together in a really special way. And I would like to suggest that when you get to know Nelson, whether it be in the professional or the personal manner, then it becomes quite hard to forget him, or actually to even want to forget him. And I think that in 100 years from now, people will still feel both admiration and affection for him and think that it is worthwhile remembering him.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen, for your presentation, your final comments. And I want to thank our commentators, Professor Lambert, Admiral Foggo, and Fleet Commander Vice Admiral Jeremy Kidd for joining us today. It's time to come to a close, and we're going to be posting this program on YouTube. I think that we had a few technical glitches. We'll clean that up and get this up here in a few days. And so please share this with your friends. Next month, second Saturday, is going to coincide with our annual meeting, which will feature our annual Leighton Lecture to be given by Captain Dan Peterson, who wrote a fine book on the origins of Top Gun. And looking forward into the third quarter of 2021, our second Saturday programs for July will look at the relationship between the United States Navy and baseball, just before our All-Star game. August will feature our art retrospective of the works of Arthur Beaumont, with his famed artist's son, Jeffrey. And September 2nd Saturday just happens to fall on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So we'll commemorate that event and take a look on how our Navy responded to the attack, those attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. We're going to be returning to hosting live events, starting with a luncheon on August the 12th, 2021 at the Army-Navy Country Club to honor the 2020 Commodore Knox Medal recipients, recognizing their lifetime achievement of work in naval history, Captain Peter Swartz and Dr. Michael Crawford. Again, thank you for joining us. And remember, if you're not a member of the Naval Historical Foundation, please consider going to www.navalhistory.org and sign on today. Thank you much. Signing out here from the headquarters of the Naval Historical Foundation here at the Washington Navy Yard.